The bank door in Cedar Bend, Wyoming Territory, slammed hard enough to rattle the glass, and Nora Aldridge stood in the dust of the street with a foreclosure notice crumpled in her fist and nowhere left to turn but a stranger's kindness. It was the summer of 1878, and the sun over the Wyoming plains had a way of making a person feel small, the sky stretching out flat and endless above the sagebrush and the red rock buttes in the distance. Nora had ridden into town that morning with her chin high, certain she could reason with Silas Whitlock the way she had reasoned with cattle buyers and grain merchants since she was 17 years old. She had been wrong. Whitlock had sat behind his mahogany desk, his silver watch chain catching the light through the window, and told her in that same syrupy voice he always used that the note her father had signed 2 years before was due in full within 30 days, $2,000, or the ranch and everything on it would belong to the Cedar Bend Bank and Trust, which was to say, it would belong to him. Unless, of course, he had said, folding his hands and smiling the way a man smiles when he already knows he has won, you reconsider my offer, Miss Aldridge. Marry me and this unpleasant business disappears. The debt is forgiven. Your father's ranch stays in the family, so to speak. She had told him what he could do with his offer, in words her mother would have been ashamed of and her father would have been proud of, and then she had walked out before he could see her hands shaking. Elias Aldridge had died 8 months earlier, in the dead of a Wyoming winter, coughing blood into a handkerchief while Nora held his hand and promised him she would not let the ranch go. He had built it up from nothing, 40 acres that had grown into 600, all of it fed by Cedar Creek, the only water in 20 miles that ran clean and steady even in August. Whitlock wanted that water more than he wanted Nora, though he was not above wanting both. Every rancher in the valley knew it. Whoever controlled Cedar Creek controlled Cedar Bend, and Silas Whitlock intended for that to be him. Nora was 24 years old, unmarried, and, according to the laws that governed decent society if not the laws of the territory itself, entirely too independent for a woman without a husband to defend her. She stood on the boardwalk outside the bank with the notice trembling in her hand and thought, not for the first time, that her father should have taught her less about cattle and more about how to make herself small enough for men like Whitlock to overlook. It was there, in that moment of raw and helpless fury, that she first laid eyes on Andrew Conroy. He was leading a string of 6 horses down the middle of Main Street, dust rising around his boots, his hat pushed back off a face that had clearly spent years squinting into wind and sun. He could not have been more than 28, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked cattle for a living, with a stillness about him that made the horses trust him even as a runaway freight wagon came barreling around the corner by the mercantile, its team spooked by a dropped crate of tin pans. Nora saw it before anyone else did. The wagon driver had lost the reins entirely, and the horses were running blind, straight toward the boardwalk where a young boy stood frozen, too scared to move. "Look out!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the clatter of hooves and wood. Andrew Conroy did not think. He dropped the lead rope of his string, closed the distance in 3 long strides, and swept the boy up under one arm just as the wagon careened past, close enough that the wind of it knocked Nora's hat from her head. The wagon crashed into a hitching post 20 feet on, splintering it to kindling, and the horses finally stumbled to a stop, sides heaving, eyes wild. For a moment the whole street was silent except for the boy crying and his mother running to gather him up, sobbing her thanks. Andrew Conroy stood in the middle of the street, dusting off his hat against his thigh, looking as though he had done nothing more remarkable than tie his boots. Nora found herself walking toward him before she had decided to. "That was a fine thing you did," she said. He looked at her then, and she noticed his eyes were the gray-green of sage after rain. "Wasn't nothing," he said. "Boy didn't deserve to get run down on account of somebody's dropped pans." "Not nothing," she said. "Most men would have frozen same as he did." He shrugged, and there was something in the set of his jaw that told her he did not care much for praise. "You dropped this," he said, and bent to retrieve her hat from the dust, brushing it off before he handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. It meant nothing, she told herself. It was only a hat. "Nora Aldridge," she said, because it seemed foolish not to introduce herself to a man who had just saved a child's life in front of her. "Andrew Conroy," he said, "just passing through. Got a string of horses to sell down in Cheyenne and thought I'd water them here first. You're not from Cedar Bend, then?" "No, ma'am, not from anywhere in particular anymore." There was a weight behind those words that she recognized, the weight of a man who had lost something and had not found a way to say so out loud yet. She should have simply thanked him again and gone on her way. Instead, she found herself glancing back at the bank, at the foreclosure notice still crumpled in her fist, and an idea began to take shape in her mind so audacious that she nearly laughed out loud at herself for thinking it. "Mr. Conroy," she said, "have you got somewhere you need to be tonight?" He looked at her carefully, the way a man looks at a horse he is not sure he trusts yet. "Nowhere that can't wait a spell. Why do you ask, Miss Aldridge?" "Because I have a business proposition for you, and it is going to sound strange, and I need you to hear the whole of it before you say no." He considered her for a long moment, and something in his gray-green eyes told her he had heard enough town gossip already, in the hour he'd been watering his horses, to have some notion of who Silas Whitlock was and what kind of trouble a woman standing outside his bank might be in. "All right," he said. "I'm listening." They walked together to the edge of town, past the last of the false-fronted buildings, out where the grass started and the noise of Cedar Bend fell away behind them, and Nora told him everything. She told him about her father, about the note, about the $2,000 she did not have and the 30 days she had been given to find it, about Whitlock's proposal and what it would mean to accept it, and what it would mean to lose the ranch instead. "I don't want your money, Mr. Conroy, because I expect you haven't got $2,000 any more than I have," she said. "But I need to be married, not because I want a husband. I do not. I had a fiancé back in Ohio who broke it off 6 days before the wedding because my father lost half his herd to blackleg that spring, and suddenly I wasn't worth marrying anymore. I don't have use for romance, Mr. Conroy, and I don't have time for it either. What I need is a man who will stand beside me, sign a paper, and give Silas Whitlock no legal ground to force my hand. A marriage of convenience, plain and simple. I would give you a share in the ranch, a place to put down roots if you wanted one, and my word that I would never ask more of you than what we agreed on." Andrew Conroy was quiet for a long while, long enough that Nora began to regret every word she had said, certain he would laugh at her or, worse, pity her. "You're asking me to marry a woman I met an hour ago," he said finally. "I am. Just like that. Just like that. I don't need a wedding, Mr. Conroy. I need a witness and a signature and a man willing to stand in front of Silas Whitlock and make it plain that I am not for sale and not for the taking." He looked out over the grass, toward the hills where the light was starting to turn gold with the coming evening, and Nora saw something pass behind his eyes, some memory she could not name. "I had a home once," he said slowly, "in Missouri. My daddy built it with his own hands, same as your father built his ranch, I expect. A man named Cutter ran the county bank, called in a note during a bad year, same as your Whitlock is doing to you, and there wasn't a thing my family could do about it because we didn't have anybody to stand with us. We lost it. My daddy never did stop grieving that land, not until the day he died." He turned to look at her. "I've been drifting since I was 19 years old, Miss Aldridge, selling horses and working cattle and never once staying anywhere long enough to call it home because I never found anything worth staying for. Maybe that's about to change." "You'll do it?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I'll do it," he said. "Not for the money, and not for the land, though I won't pretend a stake in something wouldn't sit well with a man who's slept under a different sky every night for near 10 years. I'll do it because Silas Whitlock sounds exactly like the kind of man who ought to be told no, and I'd be glad to be the one standing beside you when you tell him." They shook hands on it, right there in the tall grass with the sun going down behind them, and Nora Aldridge told herself, quite firmly, that her heart had no business beating as fast as it was. The Reverend Josiah Whitfield kept the only church in Cedar Bend, a small white clapboard building with a bell that had been hauled in by freight wagon from Omaha 5 years before, and he was sweeping the front steps when Nora and Andrew found him the next morning. "Reverend," Nora said, "we need to be married. Today, if you'll do it." Whitfield was a man well past 60, with a face weathered like old saddle leather and eyes that missed very little in a town where very little happened that a preacher did not eventually hear about. He looked at Nora, and then at Andrew, and then back at Nora again, taking his time about it. "Miss Aldridge," he said, "I have known you since you were a girl of 16, riding into town behind your father with your hair full of hay. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting this gentleman before." "Andrew Conroy," Andrew said, extending his hand. "And you intend to marry Miss Aldridge?" "I do. Today." "Today," Nora said before Andrew could answer for her. "Reverend, I won't pretend this is a love match, because you're too wise a man to believe it if I did, and I respect you too much to lie to your face. Silas Whitlock is trying to force my hand, and I need to be married to put a stop to it, and Mr. Conroy has agreed to help me. I don't need a wedding, Reverend. I don't need flowers or a dress or a church full of well-wishers. I just need a witness, someone who can stand up in the territorial land office and swear that Andrew Conroy and I are lawfully wed, so that Whitlock cannot claim otherwise. That's all I'm asking of you. A witness, and your signature on the certificate." The Reverend Whitfield set down his broom and studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened. "Miss Aldridge," he said, "I have married upward of 200 couples in this territory, and I have seen every manner of marriage there is. I have married men and women who loved each other so fiercely it near broke my heart to watch them say their vows, and I have married men and women who barely knew each other's Christian names, brought together by loneliness and hard winters, and the plain need for another pair of hands on a homestead. I do not judge any of them for how they came to my door, but I will tell you this. I have never in all my years signed my name to a marriage without speaking the words over it properly, and I do not intend to start today, not even for you, and not even under the circumstances you've described. Reverend, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly well, Miss Aldridge." His voice was gentle, but there was iron underneath it. "You are asking me to be complicit in a legal fiction, and I am telling you that I will not do that. If Andrew Conroy is going to stand beside you and put his name next to yours for the rest of his natural life, then he is going to do it with his hand on the good book and his eyes on yours, and you are going to say the words and mean them as best you can, even if all you mean by them today is a promise to try. A marriage built on nothing but paper is no marriage at all, and I will not lend my name to one. But a marriage that starts as convenience can grow into something real if both parties are willing to tend it, same as a garden grows from seed nobody expected to sprout. I have seen it happen. I intend to give the two of you the chance." Nora opened her mouth to argue further, but Andrew's hand found hers just briefly, just enough to still her. "Let him marry us proper, Nora," he said quietly. "It costs us nothing to say the words." She looked at him, surprised at the use of her Christian name, surprised more at the steadiness in his voice, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, some tightness she had been carrying since her father's funeral. "All right," she said. "Proper, then." They stood together in the small church that afternoon, with only the Reverend's wife, Constance, and old Pete Riordan, who had worked the Aldridge ranch since before Nora was born, standing witness in the front pew. The light came through the plain glass windows in long gold bars, and dust motes drifted through it like something holy, and Nora Aldridge stood in her second-best dress, the blue one with the mended hem, and held the hands of a man she had known for exactly 1 day. "Andrew Conroy," the Reverend said, "do you take this woman, Nora Aldridge, to be your lawful wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live." Andrew looked at her, and his gray-green eyes did not waver. "I do," he said, and his voice did not sound like a man reciting words for convenience. It sounded like a man making a promise. "Nora Aldridge, do you take this man, Andrew Conroy, to be your lawful husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" She had meant to say the words quickly, to get through the ceremony the way she got through a hard day's ride, head down and business done. But looking at him, at the steadiness in his face, at the way he had not once looked away from her since they had stood up together, she found the words came slower than she intended and meant more than she had planned for them to mean. "I do," she said. "Then by the authority granted to me by the territory of Wyoming and by Almighty God," the Reverend Whitfield said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Andrew, you may kiss your bride." Andrew hesitated, glancing at her as if to ask permission, and Nora, surprising herself entirely, closed the distance and kissed him first, quick and soft, more out of nerves than anything else. But Andrew's hand came up to rest against her jaw, gentle as anything, and for one unguarded moment it did not feel like convenience at all. They rode out to the Aldridge ranch together that evening, Andrew's string of horses trailing behind them on lead ropes, and Nora found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, this stranger who was now, by law and by God, her husband, and wondering what in the world she had gotten herself into. The ranch house was a low log structure with a wide porch her father had built the summer before he died, saying he wanted somewhere to sit and watch the sun go down over the water. Old Pete Riordan had a fire going in the kitchen stove and a pot of beans simmering, and he greeted them at the door with the particular gruffness of a man who had decided already that he approved of this arrangement, whatever anyone else in Cedar Bend might think of it. "Well," Pete said, looking Andrew over from hat to boots, "you look like you can sit a horse and swing an axe, which is more than I can say for most of the men who have come sniffing around this ranch since your daddy passed, Miss Nora." "Beg pardon, Mrs. Conroy, I suppose it is now." Nora felt the name settle strangely on her ears, Mrs. Conroy. She had been Nora Aldridge for 24 years, and it would take some getting used to being called anything else. "Pete's worked this land longer than I've been alive," Nora told Andrew. "He knows more about the cattle and the water rights than anybody, myself included." "Then I expect I'll be asking him plenty of questions," Andrew said, and offered Pete his hand, which the older man took after only the briefest hesitation, sizing him up with the shrewd eye of a man who had seen a great many hired hands and drifters come through in his years, and had learned to tell the honest ones from the rest by something in the grip of a handshake. That first night, Andrew slept in the barn, though Nora had offered him her father's old room, insisting that a marriage of convenience did not require them to share a bed, and Andrew had agreed readily enough, saying he'd slept in worse places than a warm barn with fresh hay, and that he did not want to push where he had not been invited. Nora lay awake a long while in her own bed, listening to the wind against the shutters, thinking about the strange turn her life had taken, and about the way Andrew Conroy's hand had felt against her jaw when he kissed her, and telling herself firmly that such thoughts had no place in a marriage that was, after all, only business. The next morning, Silas Whitlock rode out to the ranch himself, with 2 of his hired men flanking him, and found Andrew Conroy repairing a section of fence along the north pasture, shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow, looking every bit like a man who belonged there. "Who in the blazes are you?" Whitlock demanded, reining in his horse. "Andrew Conroy," Andrew said, not looking up from his work. "Nora's husband." Whitlock's face went through several colors in quick succession, settling finally on a mottled red. "That is not possible, I would have heard." "We were married yesterday afternoon, by Reverend Whitfield in front of witnesses," Andrew said, straightening up now and meeting Whitlock's eye with a calm that Nora, watching from the porch, found almost unbearably satisfying. You're welcome to check the record at the church, or the certificate filed with the Territorial Land Office. It's all done proper and legal, Mr. Whitlock. So whatever offer you had for my wife, I expect you can consider it withdrawn." "This changes nothing about the note," Whitlock snapped, recovering himself. $2,000, 30 days, or the bank forecloses regardless of who Miss Aldridge, excuse me, Mrs. Conroy, has seen fit to marry in haste. A husband picked up off the road like a stray dog does not pay debts, Mr. Conroy. "No," Andrew agreed, "but he can work same as any man, and he can make sure nobody forces his wife into a corner she doesn't want to be in. You've got your 30 days, Whitlock. We'll find a way to meet them or we won't, but either way, you'll deal with both of us from here on, square and legal, or you'll answer to the sheriff for harassment. Your choice." Whitlock stared at him for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a manner by anyone, let alone a drifter in a work shirt, and then he wheeled his horse around and rode off without another word, his men following behind, and Nora came down off the porch feeling lighter than she had in months. "Thank you," she said, "for that." "No need to thank me," Andrew said, picking up his hammer again. "That's what a husband's for, ain't it? Even a hastily arranged one." She laughed, surprising herself, and Andrew smiled at the sound of it, and something passed between them in that moment that had nothing to do with the paper they had signed the day before. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Nora had not expected and could not quite bring herself to be sorry for. Andrew worked from dawn until well past dark, mending fences, clearing brush, helping Pete move the small herd of cattle down toward better grazing near the creek. He was good with the animals in a way that impressed even Pete, who did not impress easily, gentling a spooked mare in the corral one afternoon with nothing but a low voice and patience, standing perfectly still while the horse circled him nervously until she finally settled and pressed her nose into his open palm. "Where'd you learn that?" Nora asked, watching from the fence. "Spent some years scouting for the Army, out past Fort Laramie," Andrew said. "Man learns a lot about patience when he's waiting on a signal that might not come for hours, and he learns even more about horses when his life depends on the one he's riding trusting him completely. You were a scout. For a spell. Before that I drove cattle up from Texas, and before that I was young and foolish and thought leaving my daddy's ruined farm behind meant I'd left the grief behind too." He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression that told her this was not a story he told easily. "Turns out grief rides along with you no matter how far you go. I've been carrying it a long while now." "I know something about that," Nora said quietly. "I still expect to hear my father's boots on the porch some mornings before I remember." Andrew was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Nora, truly. A man who could raise a daughter like you must have been something worth grieving." The way he said her name, plain and simple, without the formality of Mrs. Conroy or Miss Aldridge, settled something in her chest that she did not examine too closely. It was 2 weeks into their arrangement, on an evening when the sky had gone the particular violet color that came before a storm, that Nora found Andrew sitting on the porch steps with a letter in his hands, staring out at the darkening horizon. "Bad news?" she asked, sitting down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "From my sister, Mary. She's married now, living in Kansas, got 2 little ones of her own." He handed her the letter, and Nora read it in the fading light. It was a warm letter, full of news about crops and children, and a husband named Walter who apparently could not be trusted to fix a roof without falling off it at least once. But there was a line near the end that caught in Nora's throat. "I know you still think about the old place, Andrew," Mary had written. "I do too, some nights. But Daddy always said a man's home isn't the dirt he stands on, it's the people he stands with. I hope you find that, wherever you end up. You deserve it more than anyone I know." "She's right, you know," Nora said softly, handing the letter back. "About what?" "About home being people, not dirt." She looked out at the ranch spread before them, the barn and the corral and the creek glinting silver in the last light. "I used to think I loved this land more than anything. Now I'm not so sure it isn't the people who make it worth fighting for." Andrew looked at her, and the porch light caught something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Nora," he said slowly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me true, not out of politeness." "All right." "When you asked me to marry you that first day, you said you didn't need a wedding, just a witness. You said you didn't have use for romance." He turned to face her fully now. "Do you still believe that?" She wanted to say yes. It would have been easier, safer to say yes, to keep the walls up that she had built so carefully since her fiancé back in Ohio had shown her exactly how little a man's promises were worth when times turned hard. But looking at Andrew Conroy in the fading light, at the man who had defended her against Whitlock, who worked her father's land like it mattered to him, who had held her hand at the altar and meant every word of his vows, she found she could not lie to him. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "I think I'm starting to want things I told myself I'd given up wanting. Such as a husband who kisses me because he wants to, not because a preacher told him to." Andrew's hand came up slowly to touch her cheek, the same way it had at the altar, and this time when he kissed her, there was no nervousness in it at all, only a tenderness that made her whole body feel like it was leaning toward him, seeking more of that warmth. "I've wanted to do that again since the church," he murmured against her lips. "You should have said something. Didn't think it was my place. Man doesn't rush a woman who's made it plain she's got no use for romance." "Well," Nora said, breathless and smiling in a way she had not smiled in longer than she could remember, "perhaps I was wrong about that." The storm broke that night, thunder rolling across the plains like distant cannon fire, rain hammering the roof of the ranch house, and Andrew did not sleep in the barn that night, nor any night after. But even happiness, Nora would learn, could not hold back the trouble that was coming. It arrived 9 days later, in the form of a hard-faced man named Rourke, one of Whitlock's hired hands, who rode out to the ranch at midday with a folded document in his saddlebag, and a look on his face that made Pete Riordan reach quietly for the rifle he kept propped by the barn door. "Mr. Whitlock sends his regards," Rourke said, not bothering to dismount, "and asks that you review this before the note comes due next week." Andrew took the document, unfolded it, and Nora watched his face darken as he read. "What is it?" she asked. "He's claiming the marriage certificate is invalid," Andrew said grimly. "Says there's a question about whether Reverend Whitfield had the proper territorial license renewed this year to perform marriages, on account of some clerical mix-up at the county seat. Says if the marriage is invalid, then Nora's still unmarried in the eyes of the law, and the note comes due regardless." "That's a lie," Nora said, snatching the paper from him. "The Reverend has been performing marriages in this territory for 15 years. Don't shoot the messenger, ma'am," Rourke said, with the particular smugness of a man who knew he was protected by his employer's money. "Mr. Whitlock just wants everything done proper and legal. He's asked that you appear before the circuit judge when he comes through Cedar Bend next Tuesday to settle the question of the marriage's validity, before any decision is made about the note." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Nora standing in the yard with the paper trembling in her hands, the same way the foreclosure notice had trembled weeks before. "He's trying to buy time," Andrew said. "Or trying to scare you into giving up and marrying him after all to make the whole question moot." "It won't work," Nora said, though her voice shook with fury rather than fear. "I'll go to the Reverend myself. He'll have his license, I'm certain of it." But when they rode into town that afternoon and found Reverend Whitfield in his small study behind the church, his face was troubled in a way that made Nora's stomach drop. "I do have my license," he said, pulling a drawer open and producing a yellow document, "but it expired at the end of last year, and I confess I have been remiss in renewing it, being that the county seat is 2 days' ride and I had thought there was no urgency. I renewed it only 3 days ago, once word reached me of some difficulty, though I cannot say how word reached me so quickly unless someone at the land office spoke of it before I had the chance to correct the matter myself." "Whitlock has a man at the land office," Andrew said quietly. "He would have known before we did." "Does this mean our marriage isn't legal?" Nora asked, dread pooling cold in her stomach. The Reverend's face was grave but not without hope. The marriage itself, in the eyes of God, is as real and as sacred as any I have performed. Whether the territorial court will recognize the license as valid at the time it was signed, given the lapse, is a question I cannot answer, Nora. That will be for the circuit judge to decide. I am deeply sorry. This is my failing, and I will do everything in my power to make it right. Nora felt Andrew's hand find hers, steady despite everything. Then we'll stand before the judge together, Andrew said, and we'll tell him the truth. That we meant every word we said in that church, license or no license, and that Silas Whitlock is using a clerical error to try and force a woman into a marriage she has already refused twice. If there's any justice in this territory, that ought to count for something. Nora looked at him, and despite the fear curling through her, she felt something steady in her chest at the sight of his face, set and determined, not backing down an inch. Together then, she said. The week that followed was the longest of Nora's life. Whitlock, emboldened by the uncertainty hanging over the marriage, doubled his efforts to unsettle them. Fence posts along the northern boundary were found cut in the night. A section of the irrigation ditch that fed water to the lower pasture was dammed with rocks and mud, starving the grass just as the summer heat was at its worst. Pete Riordan caught one of Whitlock's men skulking near the barn after dark and ran him off with a shotgun blast into the air, though the man escaped before Pete could get a good look at his face. "He's trying to ruin us before the judge even arrives," Andrew said, standing over the broken dam with mud to his knees, working alongside Pete to clear the rocks before the whole lower pasture turned to dust. "Wants to make sure that even if we keep the marriage, we lose the ranch to ruin anyway." "We won't let him," Nora said, though exhaustion was beginning to fray the edges of her resolve. She had barely slept in days, riding fence lines at dawn, helping repair the ditch by midday, and lying awake at night beside Andrew, listening for the sound of riders in the dark. It was Andrew who found the answer, 3 nights before the circuit judge was due to arrive, and it came not from cleverness, but from an old memory he had nearly forgotten. "My daddy kept every paper related to our farm in Missouri," he told Nora, sitting across from her at the kitchen table by lamplight. "Every note, every letter from the bank, every receipt. Said a man ought to have proof of his own life, because there'd always be somebody willing to lie about it otherwise. I never understood why until Cutter called in that note and altered the terms on us, claimed my daddy owed near double what he actually did, and there was nothing we could do because we hadn't kept careful enough records to prove otherwise. We lost everything because we couldn't prove what was true." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father must have kept records too. Every rancher does, especially one careful enough to build up 600 acres from 40. If Whitlock altered the terms of the note the way I suspect he has, there ought to be some proof of it, somewhere in your father's papers." They spent that whole night going through Elias Aldridge's old strongbox, kept in the loft of the barn, filled with receipts and letters, and the careful ledger books he had kept every season since he first settled the land. It was well past midnight when Nora's hands, sifting through a stack of yellowed correspondence, closed on a letter from the Cedar Bend Bank and Trust dated 2 years earlier, in Whitlock's own hand, outlining the original terms of the loan, terms that specified a sum of $1,200 at modest interest, not the $2,000 Whitlock now claimed was owed. "He raised the amount," Nora breathed, "after my father died. He must have thought there was no one left who would remember the original terms and no proof to say otherwise." "There's your proof," Andrew said, taking the letter carefully from her hands, his eyes bright with something like triumph. "Whitlock's own signature, his own words, laying out the true terms of the loan. This changes everything, Nora, not just for the marriage question, for the debt itself." Nora felt tears rise unexpectedly, tears of exhaustion and relief and something else besides, something that had been building in her for weeks now every time she looked at the man across the table from her. "We might actually win this," she said. "We will win this," Andrew said, and there was no doubt in his voice at all. The circuit judge arrived in Cedar Bend on a Tuesday morning in late August, a stern, gray-whiskered man named Judge Harmon Bellwether, who had ridden the territorial circuit for 11 years and had, by all accounts, very little patience for foolishness of any kind. The town hall was packed that afternoon. Nearly every resident of Cedar Bend crowded onto the wooden benches to watch the proceedings, because nothing so interesting had happened in the valley since the winter the river had flooded and washed out half of Main Street. Silas Whitlock sat at the front with his lawyer, a thin, nervous man from Laramie named Hicks, both of them looking entirely too confident for Nora's liking. Andrew sat beside her, his hand resting steady over hers on the table where the Reverend Whitfield's marriage certificate lay, along with the letter Elias Aldridge had kept in his strongbox for 2 years without ever knowing how important it would become. "We are here," Judge Bellwether began, "to settle a question of some delicacy, namely whether the marriage between Andrew Conroy and Nora Aldridge, performed by Reverend Josiah Whitfield on the 14th of August, is valid under territorial law, given an apparent lapse in the officiating minister's license at the time of the ceremony." "Your Honor," Hicks said, rising, "my client contends that without a valid license, the ceremony cannot be recognized as a legal marriage, and therefore Miss Aldridge remains, for purposes of the outstanding note held by the Cedar Bend Bank and Trust, an unmarried woman subject to the original terms of that agreement." "And what," Judge Bellwether asked, turning his sharp eyes toward Nora and Andrew, "do you say to that, Mr. Conroy?" Andrew rose, and Nora felt a flutter of nerves in her chest, watching him stand tall before the whole town, this man she had married for convenience and had come, in the space of a few short weeks, to love with a fierceness that surprised her every day. "Your Honor," Andrew said, "I say that Reverend Whitfield has already sworn and stands ready to swear again under oath that the ceremony he performed was conducted in good faith, that any lapse in his license was a clerical oversight promptly corrected, and that no lapse in paperwork changes the fact that Nora Aldridge and I stood before God and this community and made solemn vows to each other, vows we have kept every day since. But I would also point this court's attention to a more pressing matter, one that speaks to why this question of marriage has become so urgent in the first place." He held up Elias Aldridge's strongbox letter, and Whitlock's face went pale. "This letter, Your Honor, is in Mr. Whitlock's own hand, dated 2 years past, outlining the original terms of the loan made to Elias Aldridge. $1,200, not $2,000. I would ask the court to compare the signature on this letter to the signature on the note currently held against the Aldridge Ranch, and to ask Mr. Whitlock to explain, under oath, how a debt of $1,200 became a debt of $2,000 within 2 years, absent any additional loan or agreement signed by Elias Aldridge, who, I would remind the court, has been dead these past 8 months and can no longer speak for himself." A murmur ran through the crowded hall. Judge Bellwether's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened as he took the letter from Andrew's hand and examined it closely, then examined the original note that Whitlock's lawyer had brought forward, laying the 2 documents side by side on the bench before him. "Mr. Whitlock," the judge said slowly, "would you care to explain this discrepancy?" Whitlock's face had gone from pale to a mottled red, the same color it had turned the day he confronted Andrew at the ranch. "Your Honor, there must be some accounting error, some additional fees for—" "There is no mention of additional fees in either document, Mr. Whitlock," the judge said. "There is a sum of $1,200 in your own hand, and a sum of $2,000 in a note you claim was signed by a dead man who, conveniently, is no longer available to confirm or deny the terms you now assert. I have been riding this circuit for 11 years, Mr. Whitlock, and I have seen a great many men attempt to profit from the grief of widows and orphans in that time. I confess I find myself deeply disinclined to look kindly on such conduct." Whitlock's lawyer rose to object, But the judge waved him down. "As to the matter of the marriage," Judge Bellwether continued, "I find that any lapse in Reverend Whitfield's license was a technical and unintentional oversight, promptly remedied, and does not invalidate a marriage entered into in good faith by both parties before witnesses. The marriage of Andrew Conroy and Nora Aldridge stands as fully legal and binding. As to the matter of the note held by the Cedar Bend Bank and Trust, I am ordering an immediate audit of the bank's records by an independent examiner from the territorial capital, and until that audit is complete, no foreclosure action may proceed against the Aldridge Ranch. Furthermore, given the evidence presented today, I am inclined to believe that criminal charges of fraud may well be warranted against Mr. Whitlock, pending the results of that audit." The hall erupted into murmurs and whispered conversation, and Nora felt Andrew's hand tighten around hers, and she looked up at him with tears standing in her eyes, tears of relief so profound she could hardly speak. Whitlock was led away by the sheriff that same afternoon, his protests growing louder and less coherent with every step, and it would come out over the following weeks, once the territorial examiner completed his audit, that Whitlock had been altering loan terms and inflating debts against no fewer than 4 other families in the valley, families too frightened or too poor to challenge him the way Nora and Andrew had. Justice, when it finally came not only for the Aldridge Ranch, but for the Hendersons and the Cobbs and the widow Nielsen, whose small parcels of land had all been under threat of the same predatory scheme. Whitlock was convicted the following spring and sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Laramie, and the bank was placed under new, honest management, with the debts of all 4 families forgiven in restitution. But that was still to come. On the day of the hearing, all Nora knew was that she was free, that the ranch was safe, and that the man standing beside her, holding her hand in front of the whole town, was truly her husband in every sense that mattered. They rode home together that evening in the golden light of late summer, and neither of them said much, both too full of relief and something deeper to find easy words for it. It was only when they reached the rise above the ranch house, where the creek caught the last of the sun and turned to liquid fire, that Andrew reined in his horse and turned to look at her. "Nora," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I should have told you before now, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that if I said it too soon, you'd think I only meant it on account of everything we've been through together, the trouble with Whitlock and all of it. But I don't want there to be any more secrets between us, not after today." He took a breath. "I love you, not because a preacher told me to, and not because you saved my prospects same as I saved yours. I love you because you're the bravest woman I have ever known, and because watching you fight for this land and these people has shown me what it looks like when somebody truly belongs to a place. I want to belong here too, Nora, not just to the ranch, to you." Nora felt her heart swell so full she thought it might burst, and she reached across the space between their horses to take his hand. "Andrew Conroy," she said, "I have been trying not to fall in love with you since the day you saved that boy in the street, because I told myself I had no use for romance, and because I was afraid of being foolish again the way I was foolish once before. But I am done being afraid. I love you too. I think I have for weeks now, if I am honest with myself." They dismounted there on the rise, and Andrew kissed her long and slow in the fading light, with the whole valley spread out golden and safe below them, and when they finally pulled apart, Nora was laughing and crying at once, and Andrew was smiling in a way she had not seen since the day they met. The town of Cedar Bend, once the news of Whitlock's fraud and arrest spread, seemed to collectively exhale, and something in the whole valley loosened, as though a fist that had been clenched for years had finally opened. The Reverend Whitfield insisted, once the legal troubles were fully settled, that Nora and Andrew allow him to host a proper celebration, not a wedding, since they were already married, but a renewal of vows before the whole community, a chance for the town to witness and bless a marriage that had begun in desperation and grown, against every expectation, into something the Reverend himself called a small miracle. "You told me once you didn't need a wedding," he said to Nora, standing in the church doorway a month after the hearing, "and I told you I would not marry you without one. I was right to insist, though I confess even I did not expect matters to turn out quite so well. Will you let this old man have his celebration now, Nora? I promise it will cost you nothing but an afternoon." Nora, looking at Andrew across the churchyard, where he stood laughing with Pete Riordan and old Mrs. Henderson's grandchildren, felt no hesitation at all. "Yes, Reverend," she said. "I think we'd like that very much." The celebration was held on a bright September Saturday, with tables set up in the churchyard laden with food brought by half the families in the valley, roasted chickens and fresh bread and pies made from the season's last peaches, and fiddle music drifting up into the cottonwood trees while children ran laughing between the tables. Nora wore a new dress this time, pale yellow, sewn by Constance Whitfield with a care that brought tears to Nora's eyes when she saw it finished, and Andrew wore a new shirt bought with money from the sale of 2 of his horses, standing straight and proud beside her as the Reverend spoke once more over their joined hands, though this time the words were less a legal formality and more a blessing freely given and freely received. "I have married many couples in my years in this territory," the Reverend said to the gathered crowd, "but I do not believe I have ever seen 2 people grow so much in so short a time as Andrew Conroy and Nora Aldridge. They came to me needing a witness. I gave them a wedding instead, because I believed even then that something real might grow from the seed of their circumstance. I was right to believe it. Let this be a lesson to us all that love does not always announce itself with flowers and courtship. Sometimes it arrives disguised as necessity and blooms anyway, because 2 good and honest hearts were willing to let it." There was dancing that evening, and Andrew, who confessed he had not danced since his sister's wedding years before, stepped on Nora's feet twice before finding the rhythm of the fiddle music, and Nora laughed harder than she had in years, her head thrown back, the whole valley around her golden with lantern light and the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. Pete Riordan, standing near the punch bowl with a cup in his weathered hand, watched the 2 of them dancing and shook his head with a smile. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said to Constance Whitfield, who stood beside him. "Miss Nora swearing up and down she'd never marry, and now look at her." "Love has a way of surprising the most stubborn hearts," Constance said. "Always has, always will." Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm after that, one built not on desperation but on genuine partnership. Andrew took to ranching with the same steady patience he brought to everything, and within a year the herd had grown by nearly a third, thanks in part to a small loan, offered on fair and honest terms this time, from the newly reformed Cedar Bend Bank and Trust, now managed by a decent man named Abernathy who had been brought in from Cheyenne after Whitlock's conviction. They built a new wing onto the ranch house that first winter, using lumber Andrew and Pete cut themselves from a stand of pine up in the foothills. And by the time the spring thaw came, Nora found herself waking most mornings to the sound of Andrew already up and moving about the kitchen, making coffee before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, humming some tune he'd picked up on the trail years before and never quite forgotten. It was in the spring of 1879, nearly a full year after that first desperate day outside Whitlock's bank, that Nora told Andrew she was carrying his child, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded nervously in her lap, though she need not have worried at all, because the look on his face when she told him was one of pure, unguarded joy, the kind of joy that made him rise from his chair so fast he nearly knocked it over. Coming around the table to gather her up in his arms, "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nora, that's—" He could not seem to find words big enough for what he was feeling, and settled instead for kissing her, long and tender, his hand resting against the still flat curve of her stomach as though he could already feel the life growing there. Their son was born in December of that year, during a snowstorm that kept Pete Riordan riding hard for the doctor in Cedar Bend, while Constance Whitfield, who had midwifed half the babies in the valley over the years, sat with Nora through the long hours of labor. They named him Elias after Nora's father, and Andrew held the boy for the first time with such careful tenderness that Nora, exhausted and aching and happier than she had ever been in her life, found herself crying at the sight of it. "He's got your eyes," Andrew said softly, rocking the baby in the lamplight while the storm howled outside the shuttered windows. "He's got your stubborn chin," Nora said, laughing weakly. "Poor thing is doomed." 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, and the ranch house that had once felt too large and too empty in the months after Elias Aldridge's death now rang with the sounds of children's laughter, of Pete Riordan telling tall tales by the fire in the evenings, of Andrew teaching young Elias, barely old enough to walk steady, how to pet a gentle mare without startling her. Reverend Whitfield, growing older now but still sharp-eyed as ever, baptized both children in the same small church where he had married their parents, and he liked to tell the story, whenever asked, of the young woman who had come to him wanting nothing more than a witness, and the drifter who had agreed to marry a stranger out of nothing but a sense of what was right, and how he, an old preacher who had seen every manner of marriage the territory had to offer, had looked at the two of them standing before him and known, somehow, that something true might grow between them if only given the chance. "I have never regretted insisting on those vows," he would say, usually with a cup of coffee in hand and a twinkle in his eye. "Nora Aldridge told me she didn't need a wedding. I married her anyway. Best decision I ever made as a man of God, and I have made a good many decisions in my time." Cedar Bend itself grew and changed over the years that followed, as the railroad finally reached the valley in 1882, bringing new settlers and new prosperity, though the Aldridge Conroy Ranch, as it came to be known, remained the largest and most respected spread for 20 miles in any direction, its water rights secure, its herds healthy, its name synonymous in the valley with fairness and hard work, everything Silas Whitlock had once tried to take by fraud and force. Nora Conroy, as she was known now, though she still signed business papers as Nora Aldridge Conroy out of respect for her father's memory, would sometimes stand on the porch her father had built, watching the sun go down gold and red over Cedar Creek, with Andrew's arm around her waist and their children playing in the yard below, and think back to that desperate day outside Whitlock's bank, when she had believed herself entirely alone in the world, with nothing left to fight for but stubborn pride. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked Andrew one evening, years later, as they stood together watching Elias, now a sturdy boy of 8, teaching his younger sister Grace how to whistle through a blade of grass, both of them dissolving into giggles at their own ineptitude. "That first day, how strange it all was. Every day," Andrew said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "I think about how close I came to riding straight through Cedar Bend without stopping. Might have, too, if that fool wagon driver hadn't dropped his crate of tin pans right when he did. Fate, maybe," Nora said. "Or just good fortune," Andrew said, "though I've come to think there's not much difference between the two, so long as a man's willing to recognize it when it comes knocking. The Reverend always says love arrives disguised as necessity." "The Reverend's usually right about most things," Andrew said, "though I'd add that necessity only opens the door. A person still has to choose to walk through it, and choose again every day after if they want what's on the other side to last." Nora turned to look up at him, at the lines that had started to form at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into Wyoming sun, at the gray that had begun to thread through his dark hair, and felt a wave of love so profound it nearly took her breath away, the same way it had that first evening on the rise above the ranch, when he had told her he loved her under a sky turning gold with sunset. "I chose right," she said. "Best decision I ever made, marrying a stranger off the street." "Best decision I ever made, agreeing to it," Andrew said, and kissed her again, slow and sweet, while their children's laughter carried on the evening breeze and the creek ran on steady and clear behind them. The same water that had once nearly cost Nora everything, now simply the sound of home. They lived out their years on that ranch together, weathering droughts and hard winters the way all ranching families in the territory did, but never again facing the kind of desperate fear that had brought them together in the first place. Pete Riordan worked the ranch until he was well past 70, finally retiring to a small cabin Andrew built for him near the creek, where he spent his last years fishing and telling stories to Elias and Grace, and later to their own children, about the drifter and the rancher's daughter who had married for convenience and found love instead. Reverend Whitfield officiated at both Elias and Grace's weddings, decades later, standing a little more stooped than he had in 1878, but with the same sharp eyes and the same insistence on real vows, spoken with real meaning, no matter the circumstances that had brought the couples before him. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children had grown and gone to build their own lives, Nora and Andrew would sit together on that same porch, watching the same creek catch the same golden light, and Nora would sometimes think of that terrified young woman standing outside Whitlock's bank with a foreclosure notice crumpled in her fist, certain she was utterly alone in the world. She had told the Reverend she did not need a wedding, only a witness. She had gotten so very much more than that, and she thanked God every single day of her life after that Josiah Whitfield had been wise enough and stubborn enough to give her a real marriage instead of the empty formality she had asked for, and that Andrew Conroy had been passing through Cedar Bend at exactly the right moment, leading a string of horses down Main Street, when a woman with nowhere else to turn had needed, more than she knew, someone willing to stand beside her. Their love had not begun with romance. It had begun with necessity, with desperation, with two wounded people finding in each other something neither had expected to find again. But it had grown, season after season, into something as steady and enduring as the creek that ran through their land, as certain as the Wyoming sunrise, as real as any love story ever told in the territory. And it remained, for the rest of their long and happy lives together, exactly what the Reverend had promised it could become on that first strange wedding day. Not a legal fiction, but a marriage, true and whole and lasting, built by two hearts willing to choose each other, again and again, for as long as they both should live.